I'm gonna put everybody. Okay, well, I'll start off with saying a little bit about the Wild Rice Project. And also thank you so much for everybody coming with my laptop down so you don't get dizzy. We'll do this. Thank you everybody for coming. I am Abby Roweeder. I'm the Wild Rice Project Coordinator. And then this is Dan, and he'll introduce himself. He's our guest of honor and our chef. Also, I didn't realize that you have camera above the food. That's going to be super helpful because you're a great cook. So, but yeah, thank you so much to everybody for coming. Thank you for being flexible with our technical difficulties. We had a little mix up. So, but we're here, we made it, and I'm super, super excited. The Wild Rice Project is through the Friends of Finland nonprofit Finland food chain. It's located in Finland, Minnesota, which I'm sure majority of you, if not all of you, are familiar with that, the location in Finland. So we have three aspects to the project. We have a processing facility of wild rice and other small grains that we opened up. We processed about 3,000 pounds of rice this season, even though rice was kind of all over the place this season. So it was really exciting and really great. So we have the processing facility, and then we have a mentorship and apprenticeship program, kind of teaching people how to rice, how to process rice, and everything about wild rice in between. And then kind of what we're doing right now, the third portion is the education portion, teaching people about wild rice from how it grows, the nutrition of it, to cooking with it. So I won't take up too much time, so I will let Dan go ahead, but thank you everybody, and I'm going to mute myself and get ready here, and I'm super excited.
All right, thank you, Abby. Welcome everyone. My name is Dan Cahill Matthews. I'm the team facilitator of the Finland food chain. And before I go into any other talking or details, we want to get this dinner on the table tonight if you're cooking along with us. So we're going to get right into the two longer steps of cooking, which is the first one, which is our wild rice. So what you want to do with this is you want to make sure it's well rinsed. This is wild rice if you received a meal kit that was processed at the wild rice facility in Finland. And so this is wild harvested rice as opposed to what would be a cultivated rice. And as it is going through the processing facility, they do a great job removing the chaff, removing some of the different components to make sure we got the quality wild rice, but we still want to give it another rinse just to get off any of the last dust or other remnants of that. So I'm going to take a fine mesh strainer, dump my cup of wild rice into that, and then I'm going to run this under the sink just for a couple of seconds, get it right into a pot, and cover that with vegetable stock or water or chicken stock, whatever you have, just something to add a little bit of flavor. So I'm going to spend about 20 seconds getting this rinsed off under cold water. And then getting that right into my saucepan. And making sure it's covered by about an inch or so of water, veggie stock, chicken stock. I'm gonna get that going on high heat and let that cook. We want that wild rice to be cooked through so we can add it to our filling. And so that's big step number one. We'll go into a little bit more detail about rinsing rice, about the difference between the two types of rice that I showed here. But the next step we have, which is also a longer step here, is getting the squash into the oven. So I'm going to move all my ingredients, exposing my second cutting board. And we have this delicata squash, which I chose because it will cook a bit faster than, say, an acorn or something even bigger like a Hubbard or a Kaboka. They have a bit thinner flesh, and you can even eat the skin. These came from Wolf Ridge Farm. You can see on this camera that we do have some of the soil left from the field. I'll show it up here too. So if you see that on your squash, you're going to want to give that a rinse too. So I'm going to head over to the sink and take care of that. Getting some of that nice organic soil out of the crevices of the delicata squash. So this delicata squash, what we're going to do is cut it lengthwise. If you have a acorn squash, you can do the same thing, cut it lengthwise, or I've seen if you want like more of a bowl presentation, you can cut it in half widthwise. What I would encourage if you do that is also trim off the tip end, because you're going to want to be able to lay it flat with the bowl side up. You can't do that with this point on the acorn squash if that's what you have at home. But I'm going to show us what to do with the delicata squash. Squash can be kind of dangerous, especially if you don't have a big enough knife or enough control over your knife. So the best thing that I can suggest is to try to use as much of the heel of your knife as possible. Try to keep the tip of your knife down on the board and get a good grip on your knife. The grip we tend to use in kitchens and restaurants is to pinch the actual back of the knife so that we have the most control over it. If we're just holding it down here by the handle, we're actually not having much control over the tip, and that's when the knife can really slip. So getting the tip of your knife on the board and using the heel to really kind of cut through, adjusting the knife back, again, cut through, going until you got your vertical slice. The last thing that you really want to be doing is pushing down on the knife from up in the air, because that's when it can slip and get your fingernails. Now from this point, we've got our two halves. We're going to take a spoon and scoop out the insides. And I'm going to scoop these just into this bowl so that they could be either tossed in the trash, they could be tossed into your compost bin or pile. Or if you're really ambitious, really ambitious, you could try to separate all the seeds from the rest of the guts. And then you could make some like seasoned squash seeds. But that's a lot of trouble for these small seeds. Just going down the length of your squash, we want to open up enough of the space so that we can get a bunch of filling in there. This squash is going to be delicious. It came from Wolf Ridge Organic Farm. Once the squash are harvested, they need to cure for a little bit, just a couple of weeks. That's actually going to let them sweeten up. A lot of the flavor will kind of develop in that, and the sugars will convert so that then when you roast it, it's a bit sweeter, a bit more flavorful. I'm going to take a little bit more flesh out of this one just so we can have some more filling go in there. And then I sent out an email encouraging everyone to have their oven preheated by the time of the start of this class so that we could get the squash right into the oven. So I hope everyone did that. What we're going to do is take our baking sheet lined with parchment or foil, and then a little bit of oil. Any neutral oil will work. I wouldn't recommend using like an extra virgin olive oil if you can avoid it, just because some of those flavors are pretty strong and can even turn bitter under the high heat of a 425-degree oven. Then I'm just going to kind of rub it, make sure the oil gets all around. And we hit this with a little bit of salt too. Lay those face down, cut side down, and we're going to get them into the oven and let them roast while we're preparing the rest of our filling. All right, so if you're looking at the recipe with me, one of the interesting things that I learned pretty recently that I really enjoy doing is specifically with mushrooms, searing those in a pan separate from like your onions, from your garlic, because you can develop more flavor.
Dan, we have a couple of questions.
Okay, this is a good time to pause for those questions while we got those longer items working.
Yeah, real quick. Can you use coconut oil?
Yeah, coconut oil would work for this. It would be a great fat that would lend a little bit of additional flavor from the coconut flavor. So yeah, that can definitely work for this. It has a higher smoke point. That's really what you want to focus on, is any oils with higher smoke points. So like avocado oil would be great. Sunflower oil would be great. Just those extra virgin olive oils that have lower smoke points and are usually used for adding a lot of flavor to like raw foods. Those are the ones you want to avoid using for cooking. In a pinch, they'll work. It's not going to make a big difference to the taste of the end, or the end taste of the dish. But I just encourage always having like a high heat oil. And for me, it's just like a neutral olive oil, and then having like a tasty salads and raw food oil.
Yeah, and then the 2 weeks after picking for best flavor, does that also apply to other types of squash?
Yeah, so if you're picking them fresh from a field, that curing process applies to different types of squash, different lengths of time, depending on the size of the squash. An example is a bigger squash like this one could go even just a little bit longer. This will have a longer shelf life and can cure for just a little bit longer before you cook with it. Whereas like the Acorn Delicata patty pan, those will, I mean, you can cook with them right out of the field. It's just they'll have a little bit more of I guess I'd describe it as almost like a starchy flavor. It's not going to be like a potato at all, but it won't get the same amount of sweetness because it hasn't converted those some of those cells over into sugar, which is what is going to get that sweetness, which is what's going to give you that nuttiness in a squash, and also add some browning when you cook it at a high heat. So we're going to go ahead and get our filling working. I'm going to start by chopping some of my vegetables as my pan is getting to higher heat. I'm using a cast iron pan. This takes a little bit longer to heat up. If you have like a non-stick or something that's thinner metal that will heat up quicker, I would recommend waiting until your veggies are ready to go into the pan until you really turn that heat up. But because mine is going to take a little longer to heat up, I'm going to get it going right now. As we're preparing our vegetables, we're going to keep an eye on the wild rice. The fresh harvested wild rice is going to cook a little bit faster than the cultivated stuff, which is like from the Casey's Best brand. Like this will take probably 45 to 50 minutes to get cooking if that's what you have. But the fresh harvested wild rice should only take about 20, 25. We're going to keep an eye on it. Once we see it getting to a rolling boil, we're going to turn that down and cover it. And we want to keep all that moisture in there. I've made the mistake many times of trying to cook wild rice without a cover, and then it takes hours because all that water is going evaporating into the air as opposed to going into the rice. So I've got my rice at about a boil right now. I got to make sure I know where my lid is. I set it down somewhere. Oh, here it is in the middle of my range. And I'm going to get that covered up. Before I cover it up, I'm just going to add a little bit of salt to it so you can get some more seasoning in there. Turn my heat down to low. All right, so to the mushrooms. Those are going to be the first thing we're working on. I'm going to leave these in slices because I want to get some good searing on it. I want to get some good browning. So I'm going to lay the mushroom flat. What you can do to make it even more safe while you're chopping is to pull out that stem. Then you can really lay it flat. And I'm going at about, I'd say 1/8 to 1/4 inch thickness in these slices, closer to 1/8. Slicing through these mushrooms. And mushrooms are great, really pair well with fall flavors. But if you want, and for our purpose, making a vegan stuffed squash, mushrooms are going to kind of be like our meat texture. But this is a great place to substitute sausage for your stuffed squash, chicken in your stuffed squash. This is a great place to add some more of that flavor. So I'm going to get one more mushroom cut just to fill up my measuring vessel. And then I'm going to put some oil in my pan. On the recipe, what does it say here? About 2 tablespoons? Yeah. And make sure that oil's hot. So now if you have that nonstick, go ahead and turn, or if you have a thinner metal pan, go ahead and turn it on, get the pan hot. Add your oil, make sure that's hot. Then we're going to add in our mushrooms. And you want to hear that sizzle sound of the saute. I'm going to move my mushrooms around to try to get it into almost like a single layer. I'm using my fingers. Force of habit. I encourage everyone at home to use utensils so that they don't burn themselves. This isn't me trying to be tough. This is just me working a little bit quicker, lazier. So don't feel like you need to use your fingers to move those mushrooms around. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because, and another key thing here is I'm not adding any salt right now. If I were to add salt, it would pull some of the moisture out of the mushrooms and then they'd steam more than they'd sear. And because we're not adding meat to this recipe, Because I prefer my mushrooms to have more of that seared texture, that's why I'm putting them in the pan like this. Gonna let them go for probably about a minute, 2 minutes to get some color. I've got my utensil ready to go because once they get hot all the way through, I'm not gonna reach my finger back in there. I only feel comfortable doing that right at the beginning. And we're gonna move our attention to our onion, our celery, and our garlic. So if you got the meal kit, these onions also came from Wolf Ridge. We're gonna start by cutting the top off, cutting the onion in half, peeling the outer layer. And so when I've been doing these cooking demos over the summer, when I've been even doing the classes, when we did pasties, when we did Moyaka, I want to teach some really adaptive skills, things that you can use in all different types of cooking. One of those adaptive skills is listening for certain sounds. I can hear right now that my mushrooms are sauteing really quickly. They're sizzling, which means that they're getting a lot of heat contact to that hot pan in the oil. That tells me I'm going to stir them up. So I trust that more than I trust setting a timer. A timer is going to get you in the ballpark, but learning these skills, learning to listen for a change in how hard it's searing, how loud it sounds, and adapting those skills, that's what's going to allow you to not need to follow any specific recipe, but just use those as a guide. So I'm going to let the mushrooms go for just a little bit longer, and we're going to cut up our onion. So for that, we're going to slice it vertically. And we're going to medium dice here, so about 1/2 inch size chunks. And then we'll cut it horizontal. Put those into my measuring.
Dan, is there any way that we can see your pan with the mushrooms?
Yeah, I can bring that over. So I've still got them in the single layer. You can see I've got some coloring over the edges. And I could have even let them go a little bit more. I was, multitasking here and talking while I cook kind of changes my perception of time. So I could have even let them go a little bit longer to get more of that color, but we do have some nice browning working on these mushrooms. I'm going to finish cutting my onion, those 1/2 inch vertical slices. Then turning the onion, slicing down. Once I get about 2/3 of the way down, I kind of flip my onion, get 2 more chops, and then back, just to try to make the most, waste the least amount of that onion. All right, so as you're cooking at home, if your mushrooms are getting close to done to the point that you want them, make sure you have a mixing bowl on hand. This is where we're going to mix all the filling before we put it into the squash. And when you're ready, when the mushrooms are done where you like them, you can pull them out and put them into the mixing bowl. I'm going to let them go just a little bit longer while I work on my celery next. So celery, I'm going to pull off about 3 stalks here. Going to check them. Sometimes they need to be rinsed. These are a little bit closer to the heart of the celery, so they don't have as much dirt on them. I'm just going to give them a wipe. And then I want to keep these about a similar size to what my onions were. So let's see. I'm going to go down the middle of the rib. Just give it a single vertical slice. And then start chopping them up. And what we're looking for here is about half the amount of onions or so. I think the recipe, as I'm looking at it here, it says 1 cup of onion, 1/2 cup celery. Yep. So we want to go a little bit less on the celery. It adds a lot of flavor. And the textures are pretty similar to onion. So we're just building layers of flavor here, but the onion gives a lot of that nice sweetness. gonna get my celery into another one of my containers. And I think my mushrooms are where I want to pull them, which is perfect timing. So I've got my mixing bowl here so everyone can see. Now my mushrooms have a bit more color on them. They got some of that browning. There it is. You can see right there the difference by letting them go. And they got a lot of that color because we didn't add salt, we didn't overcrowd the pan, and we didn't put any other ingredients in it. So we've got our mushrooms in the mixing bowl. We still have a little bit of oil in the pan. I'm going to add just one more tablespoon and get our onions and our celery going. All right. So we've got our onions and celery in the pan. With these ones, I am going to add a little bit of salt right now. I've been adding my regular salt. I completely forgot. If those of you who received the meal kit, I wanted to highlight this. Lori Callanan, who makes some of the, she sells jams and preserves at the farmer's market in Finland. She, this past spring, found a really great field of ramps in and around Silver Bay. I don't want to give away exactly where it is. I know some people protect that knowledge, but she dried them and then she made a ramp salt out of them. And it's really amazing. It adds even more of like a garlicky flavor to it. It smells incredible. It's a great way to make a fresh spring treat like ramps last through until the fall. So I'm going to use that as my seasoning in my pan. And I'm going to remember to use that from here on out for all of our seasoning. So I'm tossing, sauteing the onions and celery. Gosh, what a classic good kitchen smell. Onions and celery. The next thing we're going to get ready is our garlic. And for those of you who received a meal kit, the garlic is really special too. The garlic came from Round River Farm, Dave and Lisa Boz. And so that's one of the crops I know that they had in abundance this year. And so we're really fortunate to be able to get some garlic from that. So I'm going to grab, let's see, for this amount of filling, the ramps add some garlicky flavor. So I'm going to make sure to think about that. And I'm deciding to use just 3 cloves of garlic here. So I'm using the side of my knife to crush them. That helps get rid of the paper. And then they peel really easily. There it is. And then because we're going to be cooking these in with our filling, and then we're going to be stuffing the squash and putting it into the oven, we can go a little bit bigger on this garlic. We don't need to mince it too fine. So what I'm going to do is give it a couple vertical chops. And I say vertical meaning looking at this clove of garlic lengthwise, a longer way. So I'll show that on here. Slicing it lengthwise. And then now that I've got all my garlic kind of lined up, I'm just going to go horizontal and give it a rough mince. I do want some bigger chunks because it'll have plenty of time to cook down. And so the flavor won't be too sharp. We don't really need to worry about it. So I'm going to set that aside, keeping an eye on my filling, giving it a toss, and then also checking in on my wild rice. Want to give that a stir here. So we want to stir the wild rice occasionally just to make sure it's not sticking to the bottom and burning. Yeah. So we've had this wild rice in for just about 20 minutes. And if I were to pull it up, you could see if the steam isn't too invasive. It's already kind of getting to the point that we want it to be cooked. Needs just a little bit longer. If you have the cultivated wild rice, that's probably going to need another 15 minutes or so, but we're getting really close. So I'll let that go a little bit longer, and we're going to work on our kale. So in the meal kits, we got this beautiful kale from Wolf Ridge Farm. I asked Sarah, the farmer, what variety it was, and she said it's called boar kale, B-O-R. So it's just regular green boar kale and then red boar kale. So we're going to pull our rubber bands off. And we're going to strip our kale by using kind of like a pinching motion. Starting, what I like to do is start near the top, about 2/3 of the way through, and pinch back towards the base of the stalk, and then pinch the rest off. And that leaves us with a really nice clean stalk. I'm going to suggest that we just set these aside right now instead of tossing them, because I have a trick where we might be able to use these to keep the delicata squash balanced in the oven so that they don't tip over and lose all the filling. So we're just going to hold on to those. You could also eat these, saute them, blanch them, steam them. They are really pretty good to eat. So again, third way up the stalk, pulling down towards the base, then finishing off the top. So I'm going to take probably 4 to 5 leaves here. The recipe that I'm making, I probably should have talked about this at the beginning, is for a single delicata squash. It's to serve 2 people. The recipe that I wrote is to serve 4 people. Now I'm going to make a little extra filling for myself because I've got a whole bunch of other squash around, some different acorn squashes, and I might want to make some more stuffed squash later this week, or just eat the filling by itself. It'll be really delicious. But the recipe is to serve 4. It's 2 each delicata squash, and then the rest, that's what the recipe that I sent out in the email. What I'm cooking here is for 2 servings instead of 4 servings. So I'm just going to break this up into 2 different piles to make it more manageable, and just kind of go with a rough chop through it. I make a loose ball with my hands to bring it all together, just so it's not so unruly. And then I run my knife through it. All right. So at this point, we've got our larger aromatics, our onions and celery cooking away. They're getting some nice color. And we've kept our garlic to the side for now, because if I would have added it too early, the garlic would have burnt in the pan. But I feel like we're at a pretty good spot for me to add the garlic. So we're going to throw the garlic in, stir it around to warm it through. But again, we want to be careful not to burn it. Garlic turns really bitter really quickly when it burns. And then we're going to get our kale ready to toss in as well. All right. So I'm just going to clean up my station a little bit while I'm letting our aromatics saute away. And once you're really able to kind of start smelling that garlic, that's when you can add the kale. So we'll toss our kale into our pan. Stir that up a bit. And then I listed as an optional ingredient on the recipe some white wine. And I have that here. What I'm going to do is, once the kale just gets a little bit sauteed, a little bit wilted, I'm going to add a splash of the white wine here.
Speaking of white wine, someone asked, what adult beverage would you recommend to pair with this dish?
White wine would certainly be good, because we're using, it's a vegan dish right now. We haven't added any butter. We haven't added any meat. I think white wine would pair really well with it. Our flavors are really nice and light. If we were to add some like sausage to this, then I might suggest a red wine. I'm really glad that this question was asked, because this beer that that my wife set aside for me has been tempting me this entire class. And I think it's a good excuse to go ahead and open it and have a sip. So yeah, I'm drinking a beer with it. This is let's see, it's an IPA. I think that would go really well with these flavors. You just can't really go wrong with any beers, I think. That's a really fun thing about cooking at home, especially cooking with other people or for other people, is when you can have a drink while you're doing it, an adult beverage or a non-alcoholic beverage, and just enjoy the experience, enjoy the time together.
Is there something that we can replace for those of us in a dry home, or I don't have any white wine with me? Is there something that we can sub for the wine in the recipe, like a vinegar?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. If you have some more of your veggie stock left over, that would be great. Whatever you use to cook the rice, you could use a splash of that in the pan to make sure that you can deglaze it. A little bit of vinegar, like a white wine vinegar would be good. You don't want to go as heavy as you would with the wine or the stock. And then also just some water to steam it, to deglaze it would be great. So any of those are good options. All right, so now that pretty much all the moisture has cooked out of the bottom of my pan, I'm going to turn my heat off and turn my attention to the sage or rosemary if you have it. So sage is a classic fall herb. I'm just going to pick a handful of leaves. This sage that came with the meal kits, again, was from Wolf Ridge Organic Farm. Just smells so, so good. And it pairs really well with kind of the nuttiness and butteriness of the squash, the earthiness of the mushrooms. It's a perfect herb for fall time. Always makes me think of like Thanksgiving. So I'm just going to stack my leaves, roll them up a bit, and get what's called a chiffonade, which is really thin slices, little ribbons of sage. And I've got about 2 tablespoons worth here. And that's going to be enough for my filling. So we didn't want to add the sage to all the hot ingredients while they were cooking in the pan, because that was going to kind of wilt the sage too much, pull out some of its flavors, and it would have gotten a bit bland. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take our mixing bowl that already has our mushrooms. We're going to put the rest of our filling in there that we just sauteed. And let's see, I'm eyeballing now because I only have 2 squash to fill. Oh, I can add the rest of this because I said I was going to have leftovers. And then now that our hot filling is off of the pan, that's when we are going to add the sage, just to preserve some of that herbiness of it. And we can toss that around. And it smells so good. It's so fragrant doing it this way, because the residual heat is just going to interact with some of the oils that naturally occur in the sage that really make those vibrant smells pop. All right, I'm gonna take a look at my rice. Oh yeah, we're good on the rice. I'll bring this over to try to show what I'm looking for. We want these rice, for lack of a better word, we want the kernels to kind of have puffed. Let's see, try to get the steam out of the way as much as I can. So they've puffed a bit. There's some of the rice still has retained its shape, but a lot of the rice is puffed and kind of curled a bit. That's what we're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and strain my rice. Then we're going to add that to the fill. So back at the beginning, when I encouraged us to all wash the wild rice, that's a practice I encourage with all rice. The only exceptions would be if you're making like a 90-second microwave rice, ready rice or something. But if you're making white rice, brown rice, wild rice, rinsing at the beginning is really going to pull away some of the dust and the other starches that are there. So when you cook the rice, the texture is going to be a lot better when it comes out. It's going to be a lot cleaner flavor. So we're going to add our wild rice to the mixture. And stir to combine. And the last ingredient that we want to add, which will give us a little more texture, is our almonds, or our nuts, I'll say. I'm using pumpkin seeds or pepitas here, which are roasted, salted. They're real nice and crunchy. Pecans or walnuts are great. Almonds would work as well. I would probably go with like a sliced or slivered almond as opposed to a whole almond in this dish. Sometimes if you're scooping through your squash to take a bite, to have a whole almond might catch you off guard. But these pumpkin seeds are really nice because they're kind of, it makes sense. Pumpkin is a squash. The pumpkin seeds coming out of the pumpkins would be great to put back into this dish. If you would have roasted the fillings that we pulled out from the squash, that would be another option. But this is going to add some nice contrast of texture to our filling. They'll stay crunchy even when they get roasted. And it's a great complement. Another thing that I've seen a lot of different recipes like this add would be like some dried fruits, whether it's a raisin or a dried cherry. That's another option that you have here. All right. So we've got our filling. I am going to grab a spoon to do a taste test to see where it's at. Got a really nice earthy flavor from the wild rice and the mushrooms. I think mine needs a little bit more salt. And then this is where I see it going back to what would you use instead of wine to deglaze the pan. Someone said a vinegar, perhaps. Yeah. If you use vinegar to deglaze the pan, you're probably going to get enough acidity, enough vinegar flavor when you taste test it right now. If you didn't use a vinegar to deglaze the pan, you might want to add a little bit of vinegar right now just to give it that punch, that brightness. In fact, I'm going to do that myself. So I have just a little touch of champagne vinegar. Anything will work because we're not using too much. Even just plain white vinegar would work here if you're not going to add too much. All right. So our filling's ready. We're going to set that aside. Take a look at our squash. Okay. This is looking really nice. You can see this squash has really browned around the edges. When I flip it over, it'll really be apparent. I'm going to take a spatula here. Carefully flip these over. Oh, that's really beautiful. All right. So these squash have gotten nice and caramelized around the edges. The flesh is really soft, and they're ready for the filling. They're laying nice and flat for us right on this pan. I'll try to show that here in this camera too. They're laying really flat for us. If they were kind of tilting or you're having a hard time keeping them flat, that's what I suggested saving these kale stalks for. You could kind of set them right alongside and create a little raft, for lack of a better word, to keep that squash in place. That's one way you could do that, but I don't see these squash having a problem. So I'm going to go ahead, take the filling. And I want to make sure that my squash are overfull, because we have all those beautiful local ingredients, local wild rice, local kale, local garlic, onions, sage. We want all that to maximize as much of that as we can get in our stuffing. Now, I wanted to make this recipe vegan so that it was really accessible to anyone who wanted to join this cooking class, and so that it would be a great kind of canvas for a recipe, focusing on the local produce that we have around here this time of year. But that being said, there are lots of different ways that you could make this non-vegan, add different flavor to it. Like I had mentioned earlier, adding a protein like sausage or chicken to it when you're making the filling. Or now could be a good time to add some like shredded cheese. Some Parmesan would be really nice on this, some Asiago, right before it goes in the oven. Everything here is fully cooked. We're just going to toss it right back into the oven just to let some of the flavors from that filling get into the squash as well. So I'd say 10 minutes here, tops. If at this point, if your squash wasn't cooked all the way through like you were using an acorn squash, you'd want to go until you poke a knife into the flesh and it's giving really easy. That's kind of the target you're shooting for. And that's when you know you're ready to put the filling in. And the other thing that I'll say here is this delicata squash, in addition to cooking a little bit faster because the flesh is not as thick as an acorn or even a patty pan, the skin is also really delicious out of these. All squash skin is edible. Some is less pleasant than others, but the delicata squash is actually pretty nice to eat. Its texture isn't off-putting and it's got a lot of flavor. So I encourage you to eat it if you feel comfortable eating the skin. So we're going to throw this back into the oven just for about 10 more minutes. And you know, what we can do with the rest of this filling is we can put this in the fridge. You can eat it just as is. It'll be pretty delicious. You could stuff additional squash, or you could use this as like a filling for a burrito or some other thing for lunch for later this week. And let's see, what else?
Hey, Dan, would nutritional yeast be good on top of this?
Yes, nutritional yeast would be amazing. I see Hudson asked that question. Hudson and I used to work together in restaurants, and he is someone who turned me on to nutritional yeast. That would be a great alternative to cheese because it has a lot of those same flavor compounds as cheese. It has that umami, and you could sprinkle that over top. That would be amazing. So, well, at this point of the class, we've got our dinner ready. It's in the oven. It just needs about 10 more minutes to go. So now's a great opportunity to take advantage of cleaning things up, making your station ready to go, putting away all of your extra ingredients, putting away leftovers. So that way, by the time the timer dings on the oven, you can just settle in, get a nice glass of wine, a beer, a non-alcoholic beverage, and just enjoy dinner. The one thing I did want to bring up before we left was this will be, as Abby was saying, there are going to be many educational components to this wild rice project. This is one of them, kind of teaching different recipes, things to do while cooking wild rice. A really neat presentation that we've archived, we have video of, was a webinar with Dr. Anello, who has done research into the nutritional benefits of eating wild rice. And this specifically was in targeting how adding more wild rice to your diet can limit chances of cancer developing. And so it's a really fascinating presentation. I encourage everyone to go check that out, and also to keep a lookout for future events and webinars for the Wild Rice Project. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Abby.
Yeah, thanks for the plug on that. We had a webinar. We're shooting to have kind of an educational webinar virtual once a month at the end of every month. And so stay tuned to figure out to learn what we're going to do next month. We tried to make this one fall spooky. We tried to come up with a Halloween recipe, but we couldn't really come up with anything wild rice related that was Halloween-ish. So if you have any ideas, feel free to throw them in the chat for next year. But yeah, if you go to the finlandwildrice.com is our website. And if you go over to, let me see if I can remember the drop-down menu, it should be in the education or the events section. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna look right now. Finland, because I want to make sure that you can get to it. Okay, so there's education, and then it drops down to media. And so you're gonna want to hit media. And then that has all of our recordings of our past webinars on there. So if you want to watch the nutrition webinar, Dr. Emily Onello out of UMD is amazing. I've been working with her quite a bit on wild rice nutrition and colorectal cancers and fatty liver disease and how wild rice decreases your chances of all of those things. Is there somewhere in Minneapolis that I can purchase your wild rice? So we don't outwardly at the moment sell wild rice. So what we do is we have people that harvest it and then we process it for them. And then some of the people that we process for do sell in the cities. I'm not necessarily sure where. I would have to get more information, but I see Dan, I think, is that your mom, Claire?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay, we can get you that info. I know a guy in Silver Bay. His name is Adam Maxwell, and he harvests like a madman in the fall, and he travels all around the state selling that rice. So definitely get you in contact with him for sure.
Or it sounds like I might need to make a trip down to the cities as well.
Either that, yep. Or you can just get Dan going. Are all the recipes that you've made in this series archived someplace? Yes, I'll put all of them as well as the recording to this meeting in that events media page on the website. And I can, honestly, I think maybe we should do a little cookbook situation in the future. I think that would be kind of fun. So it's a good idea, Lori. I think maybe we'll have a cookbook. But
and then speaking to the other cooking classes I've taught with the pasties and the moyaka, those two can be found on the Finland Food Chain website. They are archived there.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? My squash isn't done yet because I did an oopsie and forgot to start the oven. So sorry, Dan. I had one job.
Oh, that's okay. It was something that I wanted to make sure everyone was aware of because it would help speed the process up, but no big deal.
I don't know if anybody noticed, but I was also like crying because of the onions. So I was trying really hard to not show everybody. I was like sobbing while I cut the onions, but yeah. So hopefully everyone else, no one else had some itchy eyes. When you say Del glaze pan with wine vinegar, is that after veggies or out on the pan or with veggies in? That's a Dan question.
That is with the veggies in, because we want the liquid, whatever liquid we've chosen, to help steam and cook through, especially that kale, so that it can wilt down. So yeah, it's with the veggies in. You deglaze it, stir up to scrape up all the different flavor bits that have kind of gotten stuck to the bottom. And that's going to add a lot of depth of flavor to your meal.
If you're going to add meat to this, would you add beef? Would you add chicken? What meat would you add to it?
I think pork sausage would be my preferred. Like a ground sausage, even like a breakfast sausage could taste really good in this. I think my top pick, if I were to make a recommendation, is if you can find like a smoked maple sausage or maple bratwurst, that would be delicious. That maple flavor also kind of lends itself to pairing with a lot of these flavors and the sweetness of the squash. So that would be my number one pick. Ground chicken is similar. Ground beef would be pretty similar. But having something like a ground pork that has a little bit higher fat content will help you saute up the rest of those vegetables. And so that would be my recommendation.
Okay. What about venison? If our listeners or viewers are lucky enough to have venison in their freezer, would that be good with this? Wild game. Yeah, Hudson just asked.
Yeah, absolutely. Wild game would be amazing with this. And it'd also be like thinking about eating and harvesting locally. That would be the best source. Now, I don't have a ton of experience, especially working with ground wild game. So you might want to kind of, I know it's a lean meat, so you might want to adjust a little bit of your fat ratios, add a little bit more oil, or maybe add some butter while you're sauteing. Or maybe Hudson, if you want to, I know Hudson has some experience cooking with wild game. If you want to put in the chat here a suggestion of what you might do. But I could see, yeah, venison would be great. Even some waterfowl could be really good, like ducks. So yeah, lots of options, lots of flexibility. And that was the goal here, is paring this recipe down to a delicious canvas, like starting point, and then wanting to make sure everyone felt comfortable of where they could add and what they could add to really make it their own, use what they have, use what's around her, what's in season, but have this kind of the canvas of the squash that you can fill with all these delicious things. And as long as you have squash and wild rice in going into that squash, then you're basically making this recipe, and you can go anywhere else with the rest of the ingredients.
Awesome. Now I know that it is 6:54 and we said that we would go for an hour. So if anybody has any more questions, Hudson said, Dan hit the nail on the head, just add a little more fat, butter, cheese, or oil, etc. Awesome. That's good to know. I don't have any venison, but hopefully we will soon. I wanted to give you a chance to plug your barbecue situation.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Yeah, my wife and I run Baptism River Barbecue. We are a locally owned and locally sourced barbecue company. All of our meats are coming from farms along the North Shore, humanely raised animals. We are using maple wood to smoke all the meats that's harvested locally. And it's a challenge having produce year round in this part of the world, but especially during the summer, we were really fortunate to get pretty much all of our produce for our homemade pickles, our coleslaws, or even salads from local farms. So our goal is to continue to expand this, increase the capacity for people who want to get into farming locally up here. The more farmers that exist producing more vegetables, more produce, more animals, the easier it is on us, the more that we can do. So that is our mission, is to keep it locally sourced. And yeah, Baptism River Barbecue is what we're called. And we're kind of going into winter hibernation mode. Lots of planning for next summer, but we're hoping to really come out roaring for year 2.
Yeah, it's really good. I can confirm that it is delicious. So next when they open up in the summer season, definitely go check them out. So one last thing, actually 2 last things for the squash, for people like me that are a little late on the squash. How much longer should I put it in with the filling in it? Just until it's all melted?
So what you're looking for is the squash to be like 9/10 of the way roasted before you put the filling in. So you want it to be pretty much all the way cooked through. You want it to be almost ready to eat. And then you're just adding the filling in for the last 5-10 minutes of the cook, so that the squash can absorb some of those flavors. And also so that if you put any toppings like cheese or something over top, that can crisp up and just finish cooking.
Perfect. That's good to know. Thank you.
As we've been talking, I realized it's been about 10 minutes, so I'm going to pull my squash out. So yeah, we're pretty much done here. Let's try to get the angle on there. I turned off my other camera. You know what? I think I can actually turn that camera on so we can see. Can I do it on here? There it is.
Ooh.
So we can see the squash. Really nice caramelized along the outside. The rice, everything on the top is just crisped up a little bit for that texture. And yeah, we're at dinner time.
Sounds great. Hopefully you all are not too far behind, or if you're ready to go. I know that some of you had groups, so I hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening with the groups. Or if you're like me, I'm just going to eat all of it because it's delicious. And yeah, that's pretty much all we have. I want to let everybody know, stay tuned on our Facebook page. I think I'm going to start an Instagram page as well. We have some youth that are interested and want us to have an Instagram. So we're going to try that one out, or the website. So over the winter, just because we're not actively processing rice or harvesting rice, I'm still educating, still wanting to know recipes and doing stuff like this. So definitely stay tuned. And thank you so much for being flexible with the little time change that we had. And thank you so much for coming.
Good night, everybody.
Yeah, good night, everybody.